In the magnificent kingdom of Valyria, where golden towers reached toward the clouds and gardens bloomed with flowers from every corner of the world, lived a young prince named Alexander. At just 9 years old, Prince Alexander had eyes that sparkled like morning dewdrops and a smile that could brighten the gloomiest winter day. The palace where he lived was a wonder to behold, with marble halls that echoed with centuries of royal history and windows that captured rainbows in their crystal panes. The kingdom of Valyria was known throughout the land for its beauty and prosperity, but what truly made it special was not its riches or grand architecture. It was the warmth that seemed to flow from its very walls, a warmth that many said came from the kind heart of young Prince Alexander himself. Even the servants and guards, who had worked in the palace for decades, often remarked that they had never seen a royal child quite like him. Every morning, as the sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Prince Alexander would wake early and greet each person he met with genuine joy. Whether it was Margaret, the elderly kitchen maid who had served the royal family for 40 years, or Thomas, the young stable boy who cared for the horses, the prince treated everyone with the same respect and kindness he showed to visiting kings and queens. The palace guard consisted of 12 devoted men who had sworn to protect the royal family with their lives. Among them was Captain William Hartwell, a man of 52 years who had served the crown since he was barely 18. Captain Hartwell was known for his unwavering dedication, his perfectly pressed uniform, and his serious demeanor that never seemed to crack, not even during the most joyous celebrations. He had protected Prince Alexander's father, King Edmund, since childhood, and now watched over the young prince with the same fierce loyalty. Captain Hartwell had seen many changes in the palace over the years. He had witnessed coronations and royal weddings, had stood guard during times of peace and moments of uncertainty. But in all his years of service, he had never encountered anyone quite like Prince Alexander. The boy had a way of seeing people, really seeing them, that was remarkable for someone so young. The other guards often spoke among themselves about the prince's unusual habits. While most royal children learned early to walk past servants without acknowledgement, Prince Alexander would stop to ask about their families, remember their names, and show genuine interest in their lives. When young Timothy, one of the newer guards, mentioned that his mother was ill, the prince had personally asked the royal physician to visit her. When Sarah, a housemaid, celebrated her daughter's birthday, Prince Alexander had arranged for leftover cake from his own birthday celebration to be sent to her family. But it was the relationship between Prince Alexander and Captain Hartwell that truly fascinated everyone in the palace. The stern captain, who rarely spoke unless duty required it, seemed to soften whenever the young prince was near. Though he maintained his professional composure, those who knew him well could see the subtle changes, the slight relaxation in his shoulders, the barely perceptible warmth that entered his usually serious eyes. The kingdom had been experiencing a particularly harsh winter, the kind that made even the warmest hearth seem insufficient against the biting cold that crept through every crack and corner. Snow had fallen steadily for weeks, covering the beautiful gardens in a thick white blanket and making travel throughout the realm difficult. Many of the common people in the villages surrounding the palace were struggling to keep warm and fed, despite the king's efforts to provide assistance. It was during this challenging time that the palace staff noticed something different about Prince Alexander. The boy, who was usually cheerful and energetic, had grown quiet and thoughtful. He spent long hours staring out his bedroom window at the snow-covered landscape, and the servants reported that he barely touched his elaborate meals. When asked what was troubling him, the prince would simply shake his head and say he was thinking about something important. Queen Isabella, Prince Alexander's mother, was a gentlewoman with flowing auburn hair and a voice like music. She had been watching her son with growing concern, noting how he seemed to carry some invisible weight upon his small shoulders. She tried to encourage him to play with his toys or read his favorite stories, but nothing seemed to lift the mysterious sadness that had settled over him. King Edmund, too, had noticed the change in his beloved son. The king was a fair and just ruler, known throughout the kingdom for his wisdom and compassion. He loved his son deeply and wanted nothing more than to see the boy's natural joy return. Several times, he had tried to speak with Prince Alexander about what was troubling him, but the boy insisted he was fine, though clearly he was not. The palace buzzed with quiet concern about their young prince. The staff, who had grown to love the boy like their own family, whispered among themselves about his strange behavior. Margaret, the kitchen maid, mentioned that the prince had asked unusual questions about how much food the palace kitchen prepared each day and whether there was ever any left over. Thomas, the stable boy, reported that Prince Alexander had inquired about the warmest buildings on the palace grounds and how many people they could shelter. As the days passed, the mystery of Prince Alexander's preoccupation deepened. He began spending time in parts of the palace he had never shown interest in before: the storage rooms, the servants' quarters, the kitchens during the busiest preparation times. He would stand quietly in doorways, observing everything with those bright, thoughtful eyes. But when questioned about his unusual explorations, he would simply smile and say he was learning about his future kingdom. Captain Heartfelt, whose duty required him to accompany the prince throughout the palace, began to notice patterns in the boy's behavior. Prince Alexander seemed particularly interested in the areas where the cold was most noticeable: the stone corridors that received no warmth from the great fireplaces, the rooms with the oldest windows that let in drafts, and especially the guards' quarters, which were located in the tower farthest from the main heating sources. One evening, as snow continued to fall heavily outside, Captain Heartfelt observed Prince Alexander standing at the window of the guard's tower, shivering slightly in the cold air that seemed to perpetually fill that part of the building. The captain approached quietly, as was his way, and stood beside the young prince without speaking. Together they watched the snow accumulate on the windowsill while the wind howled against the glass. "Captain Heartfelt," Prince Alexander said softly, his breath visible in the cold air, "do you ever get tired of being cold when you're trying to sleep?" The question caught the captain off guard. In all his years of service, no member of the royal family had ever asked him about his personal comfort. He considered his response carefully before answering, "It is my honor to serve, Your Highness, regardless of the conditions." Prince Alexander turned to look up at the tall, serious man beside him. "But that doesn't answer my question. Do you get cold? Do you wish you could be warmer?" Captain Heartfelt looked down at the earnest face of the young prince, seeing something in those bright eyes that he had never noticed before: a deep, genuine concern for others that went far beyond politeness or royal duty. For the first time in decades, the captain found himself speaking honestly about his own experiences rather than giving the expected formal response. "Yes, Your Highness," he said quietly. "Sometimes the cold makes it difficult to sleep, but we are proud to serve your family, and such small discomforts are part of our duty." Prince Alexander nodded slowly, as if filing away this information for some future purpose. "Thank you for telling me the truth, Captain Heartfelt. I think truth is important, even when it's not comfortable to hear." As they stood together in the cold tower, neither of them knowing that this simple conversation would soon lead to an act of kindness that would touch every heart in the palace and change Captain Heartfelt's stern demeanor forever, the young prince was already forming a plan that would demonstrate the true meaning of compassion and leadership. The following morning brought with it the heaviest snowfall the kingdom of Valeria had seen in years. The wind howled through the palace corridors with unusual ferocity, and even the great fireplaces in the main halls struggled to keep the chill at bay. It was on this particularly bitter day that Prince Alexander's mysterious behavior finally began to make sense to those who had been watching him with such concern. Prince Alexander had awakened before dawn, which was unusual even for an early riser like himself. While the rest of the palace still slumbered, he had quietly made his way to his parents' chambers. Queen Isabella stirred as she heard the soft knock on their door, and both she and King Edmund were surprised to find their son standing there, fully dressed and with an expression of determined purpose they had never seen before. "Mother, father," Prince Alexander said in a voice that seemed older than his 9 years, "I need to speak with you about something very important, something I've been thinking about for many weeks." King Edmund sat up in bed, immediately alert despite the early hour. He had ruled the kingdom long enough to recognize when someone had something truly significant to discuss. "Of course, my son. What is it that troubles you so deeply?" Prince Alexander moved to stand before his parents, his small hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that reminded them both of the boy's grandfather, who had been known for his great wisdom and compassion. "I have been learning about our palace, about the people who work here and protect us. I've discovered that while we sleep in warm, comfortable beds, many of our most faithful servants and guards are cold at night." Queen Isabella exchanged a glance with her husband. They had always known their son was unusually thoughtful, but the depth of his concern for others continued to amaze them. "Tell us what you've learned," she said gently. "The guards' quarters in the East Tower have no fireplace. The servants' rooms have small windows that don't close properly, letting in the cold wind. Margaret, who has served our family for 40 years, layers 3 blankets on her bed and still shivers through the night. Captain Hartwell told me himself that the cold makes it difficult for him to sleep, yet he never complains because he is proud to serve our family." Prince Alexander paused, gathering his courage for what he wanted to ask next. "I want to give them my rooms. The royal guest chambers are warm and comfortable, with fireplaces and thick walls that keep out the cold. I want the guards and servants to sleep there while this terrible winter lasts." The silence that followed was profound. King Edmund felt his heart swell with pride and amazement at his son's selfless suggestion, while Queen Isabella found herself struggling to hold back tears of joy at the beautiful heart their child possessed. "My dear son," King Edmund said carefully, "such kindness is admirable, but there are protocols and traditions to consider. The royal family has certain responsibilities regarding their living arrangements." But Prince Alexander had thought about this too. "Father, didn't you once tell me that a true king serves his people, not the other way around? How can I learn to be a good ruler if I live in comfort while those who protect and care for me suffer in the cold?" Queen Isabella reached out to take her son's hand. "Your father and I are very proud of your compassion, Alexander. But you must understand that asking the guards and servants to stay in the royal chambers would make them very uncomfortable. They might feel it's not proper." "Then I won't ask them," Prince Alexander replied with a smile that lit up his entire face. "I'll simply have my belongings moved to a smaller chamber and have their belongings moved to the warm rooms. By the time they discover what's happened, they'll be too comfortable to argue." And so, on that snowy morning, the most unusual moving day in the history of the Palace of Valeria began. Prince Alexander, with the help of his parents and a few trusted servants who had been sworn to secrecy, began the careful task of relocating everyone's belongings. The prince insisted on carrying many of the items himself, despite protests from the adults who felt such work was beneath royal station. Margaret nearly fainted when she returned from her kitchen duties to find her small, drafty room transformed into a luxurious guest chamber, complete with a crackling fireplace, thick carpets, and heavy curtains that blocked every bit of cold air. She stood in the doorway, her weathered hands pressed to her mouth in shock, unable to believe what she was seeing. "Your Highness," she whispered, when she finally found her voice. "I cannot possibly stay here. This is far too grand for someone like me." Prince Alexander appeared beside her, grinning from ear to ear, despite the fact that his hair was disheveled and his clothes were dusty from moving furniture. "Nonsense, Margaret. You've taken care of our family for 40 years. If anyone deserves comfort and warmth, it's you." Similar scenes played out throughout the palace as servants and guards discovered their new accommodations. Thomas, the stable boy, found himself assigned to a room with a view of the gardens and a fireplace large enough to heat the entire space comfortably. The younger guards discovered they would be sharing elegant chambers with carved wooden beds and silk hangings, far cry from their usual sparse accommodations. But it was Captain Hartwell's reaction that the prince was most anxious to see. The stern captain had been away on patrol during the morning's activities, and Prince Alexander had saved the finest chamber for him, a room that had once housed visiting dukes and earls, complete with a massive stone fireplace, tapestries depicting noble hunting scenes, and windows that faced the sunrise. When Captain Hartwell returned from his patrol, still covered in snow and numbed by the bitter cold, he made his way toward his usual quarters in the East Tower. However, he found his path blocked by Prince Alexander, who was waiting with barely contained excitement. "Captain Hartwell," the prince said, trying to sound official despite his obvious enthusiasm. "There have been some changes in the sleeping arrangements. I need you to follow me." The captain, puzzled but obedient, followed the young prince through corridors he rarely had occasion to walk. When Prince Alexander stopped before one of the grandest guest chambers and gestured for him to enter, Captain Hartwell froze in the doorway. "Your Highness," he said slowly, his voice filled with confusion and something that might have been emotion, "I believe there has been some mistake." "No mistake," Prince Alexander replied cheerfully. "This is your room for as long as the cold weather lasts. Your belongings have already been moved, and I've instructed the servants to keep the fire burning day and night." Captain Hartwell stared at the magnificent chamber, then looked down at the small boy who had arranged this extraordinary gift. For a man who had spent his entire adult life maintaining perfect composure, the captain found himself struggling with feelings he had not experienced in decades. "I cannot accept this, Your Highness," he said, though his voice had grown softer than anyone had ever heard it. "This chamber is meant for royalty and nobility, not for palace guards." Prince Alexander stepped closer to the tall captain and looked up at him with those bright, earnest eyes. "Captain Hartwell, you have protected my father since you were younger than I am now. You have dedicated your entire life to keeping our family safe. You stand guard in cold towers and walk patrol in bitter weather, and you do it all without complaint. If that doesn't make you noble, then I don't understand what nobility means." The words hit Captain Hartwell like a physical blow. In all his years of service, no one had ever spoken to him about the sacrifices he had made or acknowledged the dedication he had shown. Royal guards were expected to serve silently and without recognition, and he had accepted that as the natural order of things. "Your Highness," he began, but found himself unable to continue. The emotions he had kept carefully locked away for so many years were threatening to overwhelm him. Prince Alexander seemed to understand the captain's struggle. With the wisdom that sometimes comes to children who possess truly compassionate hearts, he reached out and gently took the captain's large, calloused hand in his small one. "You don't have to say anything, Captain Hartwell. Just be warm tonight. That's all I want." And with those simple words, the dam that had held back Captain Hartwell's emotions for decades finally burst. Tears began to flow down the weathered face of the man who had never shown weakness, never displayed anything but strength and stoic dedication. But these were not tears of sadness or shame. They were tears of gratitude and wonder at the extraordinary kindness of the young prince he had sworn to protect. The sight of their stern, unshakable captain, weeping openly, sent ripples of emotion throughout the palace. Servants who had been peeking around corners to witness the scene felt their own eyes filling with tears. Even the other guards, men trained to remain impassive in all circumstances, found themselves deeply moved by what they were witnessing. Prince Alexander, rather than being frightened or confused by the captain's tears, simply stood quietly beside him, still holding his hand, offering the comfort of his presence while the man processed the overwhelming kindness he had been shown. Word of what Prince Alexander had done spread through the palace like wildfire. Every person who lived and worked within those walls, from the highest-ranking officials to the newest kitchen apprentices, heard the story of how their young prince had given up his own comfort to ensure that those who served his family would be warm and safe during the harsh winter. The transformation that swept through the palace of Valeria in the days following Prince Alexander's act of kindness was nothing short of miraculous. What had begun as a simple gesture of compassion had somehow awakened something beautiful in every heart within those ancient walls. The palace, which had always been a place of dignity and service, now hummed with a new energy, an energy of mutual respect and genuine care that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. Captain Heartfelt, who had spent his first night in the luxurious guest chamber staring at the fire in amazement, emerged the next morning as a changed man. Though he still maintained his professional bearing and continued to perform his duties with the same unwavering dedication, there was something fundamentally different about him. The rigid lines around his eyes had softened, and those who worked closely with him noticed that he smiled more readily and spoke with greater warmth. But it was the way Captain Heartfelt looked at Prince Alexander that truly revealed the depth of the change within him. Where once there had been respectful duty, there now existed something far more powerful, a devotion born not from obligation, but from genuine love and admiration. The captain began to watch the young prince with eyes that held wonder, as if he were witnessing something precious and rare that he had been blessed to protect. The other guards, inspired by both Prince Alexander's kindness and Captain Heartfelt's emotional response, began to show their own small acts of appreciation. They started standing a little straighter when the prince passed, not from formality, but from genuine respect. They began to smile when they greeted him, and several of the younger guards took to asking about his studies and interests, engaging with him as they would with a beloved nephew, rather than merely a royal charge. Margaret, the elderly kitchen maid who had served the royal family for 4 decades, found that her warm new quarters had given her more than just physical comfort. The kindness Prince Alexander had shown her had filled her with such joy that she began putting extra care into every meal she prepared. She started baking special treats for the prince: honey cakes shaped like snowflakes and warm milk with cinnamon, small tokens of her gratitude that came from a heart overflowing with affection. The other servants, too, were transformed by what they had witnessed. Sarah, the housemaid whose daughter's birthday the prince had remembered, began singing while she worked, her voice carrying through the halls like music. Thomas, the stable boy, took extra care with the prince's favorite horse, brushing its coat until it gleamed and making sure it had the finest hay and oats available. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in the atmosphere of the palace itself. Where once the relationship between the royal family and their staff had been one of formal respect, now there existed a genuine warmth that made everyone feel like part of an extended family. The servants moved through their duties with lighter hearts, and their joy was infectious, spreading to everyone they encountered. Prince Alexander, meanwhile, had settled into his new, smaller chamber, with characteristic good humor. The room, while modest compared to his previous accommodations, was still perfectly comfortable, and he declared it to be exactly the right size for a boy his age. When visitors to the palace expressed surprise at his humble quarters, he would simply explain that a good prince must understand how all his subjects live, and that he was learning valuable lessons about leadership from his experience. King Edmund and Queen Isabella watched their son's actions and their effects throughout the palace with hearts full of pride and amazement. They had always known Alexander was special, but witnessing the way his kindness had transformed an entire community of people made them realize they were raising not just a future king, but a truly exceptional human being. The story of Prince Alexander's kindness began to spread beyond the palace walls. Visitors carried the tale to other kingdoms, merchants shared it in marketplaces, and traveling musicians composed songs about the young prince who had given up his royal chambers to ensure his servants would be warm. The kingdom of Valeria became known not just for its beauty and prosperity, but for the extraordinary compassion of its future ruler. One particularly moving moment came 3 weeks after the Great Room Exchange, when a delegation of nobles from a neighboring kingdom arrived for a diplomatic visit. As was customary, they were given a tour of the palace and introduced to the royal family. When they met Prince Alexander in his modest chamber, one of the visiting dukes commented with obvious disapproval on the simple accommodations. "Your Majesties," the duke said to King Edmund and Queen Isabella, "surely your son deserves quarters befitting his royal status. This chamber seems more appropriate for a minor courtier than a prince." Before the king or queen could respond, Captain Heartfelt stepped forward. For the first time in his long career, he spoke without being directly addressed by royalty, his voice ringing with quiet authority and unmistakable pride. "Your Grace," Captain Heartfelt said, his eyes fixed on the visiting duke, "Prince Alexander occupies this chamber by his own choice. He has given the finest rooms in the palace to those who serve his family, believing that true nobility lies in caring for others before oneself. I have served this royal house for over 30 years, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that no king who has ever lived has shown greater honor than our young prince has shown through his selfless actions." The captain's words hung in the air like a challenge. The visiting nobles looked at Prince Alexander with new eyes, seeing not a boy in modest quarters, but a future leader whose character far exceeded his years. Several of them bowed more deeply to the prince than protocol required, recognizing that they were in the presence of someone truly remarkable. Prince Alexander, for his part, seemed slightly embarrassed by the captain's passionate defense. He quickly changed the subject, asking the visitors about their own kingdom and showing genuine interest in their answers. But those who knew him well could see how pleased he was by Captain Heartfelt's words, not because of the praise they contained, but because they showed how much the captain's respect and affection had grown. As winter gradually gave way to spring, and the harsh cold that had prompted Prince Alexander's act of kindness began to fade, there was talk throughout the palace about returning to the original room assignments. However, when the subject was broached with the prince, he surprised everyone by suggesting that the new arrangements should remain in place permanently. "Why should we go back to the old way?" he asked during a family discussion about the matter. "Everyone is happier now. Margaret sleeps well in her warm room, which means she has more energy to take care of us during the day. Captain Heartfelt and the guards are comfortable at night, which means they're more alert when they're protecting us. And I like my room. It's cozy and perfect for me." King Edmund realized that his son was absolutely right. The new arrangements had indeed made everyone happier and more effective in their duties. More importantly, they had created a sense of community and mutual respect that had strengthened the bonds between all who lived and worked in the palace. And so the room arrangements remained unchanged, becoming a permanent symbol of Prince Alexander's philosophy that true leadership meant serving others rather than being served. The story of the prince's kindness became part of the palace's history, told to new servants and guards as an example of the values that the royal family held dear. Captain Hartwell, who had initially struggled to accept such generous treatment, eventually came to understand that his comfort was important to Prince Alexander, and that accepting the prince's gift was itself a form of service. The captain's gratitude never faded, and he expressed it not through words, but through an even deeper dedication to his duties and an unwavering commitment to protecting the prince who had shown him such extraordinary kindness. Years later, when Prince Alexander had grown into a young man and was preparing to take on greater responsibilities in the kingdom, Captain Hartwell would often reflect on that snowy winter day when a 9-year-old boy had changed his life forever. The captain had learned that true nobility had nothing to do with titles or birth, and everything to do with the size of one's heart and the willingness to put others' needs before one's own. The palace itself seemed to remember and honor Prince Alexander's act of kindness. Even in the warmest summer months, visitors would often comment on the unusual warmth they felt within its walls. Not the physical warmth of sunshine and hearth fires, but the emotional warmth that comes from being in a place where people genuinely care for one another. And Prince Alexander, who had given away his luxurious chambers without a second thought, had gained something far more valuable in return. He had earned the deep, abiding love and respect of everyone who knew him, and had learned one of the most important lessons a future king could learn: that the greatest power a leader possesses is the power to make others feel valued, respected, and loved. The story of Prince Alexander's gentle act of kindness became a legend that was passed down through generations, inspiring countless others to look for ways they could show compassion and generosity in their own lives. And Captain Hartwell, who had once been known only for his stern dedication to duty, became known as the guard who served not just with loyalty, but with a heart full of love for the remarkable prince who had taught him that kindness was the greatest strength of all.